The conference room felt like ice when Mark spoke those words. "Lauren, we're letting you go. Effective immediately." His voice was flat, emotionless. 12 pairs of eyes stared at me from around the mahogany table. My presentation slides still glowed on the screen behind me, showing numbers I'd spent 6 months perfecting. The government contract worth $45 million hung in the air like smoke. Mr. Dalton from the State Infrastructure Committee looked confused, his pen frozen mid-note. Mark didn't even glance my way as he continued talking about restructuring and new directions. My hands went numb under the table. I forced my face into a mask of calm professionalism, but inside, something sharp and cold began forming. This wasn't just termination. This was theft. Mark wanted my deal for himself, and he'd chosen the most humiliating way possible to take it. I stood slowly, gathering my folder and laptop. Nobody spoke. Nobody defended me. The silence felt heavier than any insult could have been. I walked through the office like a ghost. My badge felt strange in my hand as I approached reception. 6 months of late nights flashed through my mind. Every phone call with Dalton, every compromise I'd negotiated, every detail I'd perfected.
Gone. Just like that.
The receptionist, Amanda, looked up with sad eyes. She'd obviously heard already. Bad news traveled fast in our Denver office. I dropped my badge on her desk without saying anything. My throat felt too tight for words anyway. The elevator doors opened and I stepped inside, watching the office disappear as I descended. My reflection in the polished steel showed a woman I barely recognized.
Pale. Shocked. Betrayed.
But underneath that shock, something else was growing. Something patient and dangerous. Mark thought he'd won by humiliating me publicly. He thought removing me from the project meant he owned it now. He was wrong about so many things. My car sat in the parking garage like a refuge. I climbed inside and locked the doors, finally allowing myself to breathe. Through the windshield, I could see Mark's office window on the 4th floor. He was laughing with someone, probably celebrating his victory. That laugh burned itself into my memory. I sat there for 30 minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, letting myself feel everything. The rage, the humiliation, the disbelief. Then I pulled out my phone and opened my personal email. Every document I'd ever created for this project was backed up there. Every conversation with Dalton. Every negotiation point. Every promise I'd made and kept. Mark might have my office and my title, but he didn't have what actually mattered. He didn't have the relationship. Dalton trusted me, not the company. That trust was built over hundreds of hours of phone calls and meetings. Mark couldn't steal that. My name is Lauren Pierce. I'm 31 years old, and until today, I was the lead project consultant at Bridgeton Construction in Denver. I specialized in government contracts, the kind that required patience and precision. The kind most people didn't have the temperament for. I'd landed the biggest deal in company history, and my boss fired me a week before the final signing. He called me too emotional once during a meeting, said I wasn't tough enough for executive-level negotiations. Meanwhile, I'd been the only one actually doing the work. Now I sat in my apartment, surrounded by moving boxes I hadn't unpacked from last month's relocation. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd moved to Denver specifically for this job, this opportunity. 3 years of proving myself in smaller roles, working toward this exact moment. And Mark had ripped it away in 30 seconds. But as I stared at my laptop screen, reviewing months of carefully documented work, I realized something. He hadn't actually won yet. 6 months earlier, everything had been different. I'd walked into the weekly meeting with a folder full of research about upcoming government projects. Mark barely looked up from his phone when I started talking. There's a state infrastructure redevelopment initiative, I explained to the room. $45 million budget. They need a firm with our exact qualifications. The other consultants seemed mildly interested, but Mark just waved his hand dismissively. Government work is slow and complicated. Too much red tape. But I'd done my homework. I knew the project director, Mr. Dalton, had worked with smaller firms before. He valued personal relationships over corporate size. I pushed harder, explaining the opportunity. Finally, Mark sighed.
Fine.
You want it so badly? Run the preliminary research. But don't waste too much time on it. That casual dismissal should have been my first warning. Mark only noticed projects after someone else proved they were valuable. Landing the first meeting with Dalton took 3 weeks of persistent but professional follow-ups. When he finally agreed to discuss the project, I prepared for days. I memorized every detail of the infrastructure plan, studied past projects he'd overseen, and anticipated every possible question. The morning of the meeting, Mark suddenly appeared at my desk.
I'll join you, he announced.
Not asked.
Announced.
During the entire meeting, he interrupted me constantly. Every time I started explaining our approach, he'd jump in with generic corporate language that meant nothing. But Dalton kept redirecting questions to me. He asked about specific technical approaches, timeline management, and budget allocation. I answered everything confidently. At the end, Dalton shook my hand and said something I'd never forget. You clearly know this project inside and out. I trust your judgment, Lauren. Mark's smile looked painted on. In the car afterward, he didn't say a word. That silence felt like thunder. Over the next 2 months, I built something rare in government contracting. Real trust. Dalton and I spoke 3 times a week, refining the proposal. He shared concerns about past contractors who'd overpromised and underdelivered. I listened carefully and adjusted our approach accordingly. Every email I sent was clear and honest. Every deadline I set, I met. Slowly, the project transformed from a possibility into a probability. That's when Mark started paying attention. First, he began asking to be copied on all correspondence. Just to stay in the loop, he explained. Then he started editing my emails before I could send them. His versions were wordier and less direct, filled with corporate jargon that obscured meaning. I pushed back once. He told me I needed to learn executive communication style if I wanted to advance in my career. So I started sending him drafts, then sending my originals directly to Dalton from my personal email. Mark never noticed. 3 months into negotiations, something shifted. Mark started attending every call with Dalton, even informal check-ins. He'd sit in my office, listening, occasionally scribbling notes. After one particularly productive conversation about environmental impact assessments, Mark asked me to summarize everything we discussed. I thought he wanted to stay informed. Instead, he began hosting separate calls with Dalton, repeating my ideas as his own insights. I discovered this accidentally when Dalton mentioned something Mark had explained that I'd actually researched and presented weeks earlier. The anger I felt was complicated. Part of me wanted to expose Mark's theft immediately. But another part, the strategic part, told me to wait. Document everything. Stay professional. Let him think he was winning. Meanwhile, I kept detailed records of every conversation, every idea, every breakthrough. Timestamps on emails. Notes from meetings. A paper trail that told the real story of who'd actually built this deal. By month 5, the contract was nearly finalized. Dalton told me privately that our proposal was the frontrunner. Your attention to detail made the difference, he said during a phone call. Most firms treat government work like checking boxes. You treated it like building something that matters. I thanked him, feeling genuine pride for the first time in months. That same afternoon, Mark called me into his office. He was smiling, which immediately made me suspicious. Lauren, we need to discuss the project structure going forward. He slid a folder across his desk. Inside were organizational charts showing a new team configuration for the final contract phase. My name appeared nowhere. Instead, Mark listed himself as lead consultant, with 2 junior associates supporting him. You've done excellent groundwork, he said, using that patronizing tone I'd grown to hate. But closing deals requires a certain gravitas. The client needs to see senior leadership taking charge. My vision actually blurred for a moment. This was theft, plain and simple. I didn't explode. I didn't argue. I simply asked, when does this transition happen? Mark looked almost disappointed by my calm response. Immediately. I'll handle the final presentation next week. You can brief me on any outstanding details. I nodded slowly, closing the folder. Of course. I'll send you everything. That evening, I worked until midnight organizing files. But I didn't send them to Mark. Instead, I created two versions of every document. One set went to him, containing basic information and public knowledge. The other set, the real work, stayed in my personal archives. Every relationship detail with Dalton. Every negotiation strategy. Every subtle promise I'd made about how we'd handle implementation. Mark could have the papers, but he couldn't have the understanding. That required months of relationship building he'd never bothered to do. By dawn, I'd effectively created an insurance policy. Mark just didn't know it yet. The board meeting happened exactly 1 week later. I'd been told to attend for knowledge transfer purposes. Mark would present, and I'd answer technical questions if needed. Except when I arrived, the atmosphere felt wrong. Mark stood at the head of the table looking too confident. The board members studied me with expressions I couldn't read. Mr. Dalton had joined via video conference, his face appearing on the large screen. "Before we begin," Mark announced, "I need to address a staffing change." My stomach dropped. This wasn't knowledge transfer. This was an execution. "Lauren has been invaluable during the research phase," Mark continued, his voice carrying false warmth. "However, as we enter final negotiations, we're restructuring the team. Lauren's contract is being terminated, effective today." The room fell silent. Dalton's face on the screen showed clear confusion. "Wait, Lauren isn't continuing?" Mark's smile never wavered. "I'll personally oversee all remaining negotiations. Lauren's work here is complete." Complete. Like I was a phase, not a person. I don't remember standing up. I don't remember walking to the door. My body moved on autopilot while my mind screamed. In the hallway, I finally stopped, leaning against the cool wall. My hands shook so badly, I couldn't hold my phone steady. This was worse than firing. This was public humiliation designed to erase me from my own achievement. Mark wanted everyone to see him as the dealmaker, the closer, the expert, and he'd calculated that I was powerless to stop him. I walked to my office, or what had been my office, and began packing. Someone had already boxed up my personal items. They'd planned this. Probably days ago. My credentials were revoked. My computer access was gone. Everything moved with corporate efficiency. But as I carried my box to the elevator, I noticed something. Dalton had sent me a message on my personal phone. "Can we talk? Something feels off about this transition." That single text changed everything. I waited 2 days before responding to Dalton. Not out of spite, but strategy. I needed distance from the raw emotion. I needed to think clearly. When I finally called him back, I kept my voice neutral and professional. "Mr. Dalton, I apologize for the confusion. The company decided to restructure at the leadership level." He was quiet for a moment. "Lauren, I've been doing this work for 15 years. I can tell when something isn't right. This transition feels rushed. Forced." I chose my words carefully. "I'm no longer with Bridgeton Construction, but I respect the work we did together. If you have questions about the project, I'm happy to clarify anything." Another pause. "Are you still consulting?" The question hung in the air like a lifeline. "I'm considering my options," I answered honestly. "I've thought about starting my own firm." He made a thoughtful sound. "Government contracts value consistency. We chose Bridgeton largely because of you. That relationship doesn't transfer automatically just because names on paperwork change." Starting a consulting firm seemed impossible 3 days ago. Now it felt like the only logical path forward. I spent a week handling paperwork, registering my business, and building a basic website. Pierce Infrastructure Consulting. Simple. Professional.
Honest.
My savings would cover maybe 3 months of basic expenses. After that, I'd need actual clients. The risk terrified me, but staying paralyzed by fear would guarantee failure. I thought about Mark constantly, which probably wasn't healthy. But the anger kept me moving forward. Every form I filled out, every business decision I made, I imagined his face when he realized what he'd lost. Not just the deal. His reputation. His credibility. Everything he'd stolen wouldn't actually be his. Meanwhile, Mark was probably celebrating. He'd sent me a brief, formal email thanking me for my contributions and wishing me well in future endeavors. The corporate speak barely masked his satisfaction. He thought he'd won cleanly. He thought removing me from the project meant he controlled it now. That confidence would be his downfall. 2 weeks after my termination, Dalton called again. This time, his tone was different. Frustrated. "Lauren, I need your honest opinion about something." Mark sent over revised budget projections. "Several key items changed from your original proposal. He's saying these adjustments improve efficiency, but they contradict things you and I discussed extensively." My pulse quickened. "What kind of changes?" He listed them. Every single modification undermined critical aspects of the project. Mark had tried to cut costs in areas that couldn't be reduced without compromising quality. He'd moved timelines that depended on specific seasonal factors. He'd completely missed why certain expenses existed. "These changes would cause serious problems," I said carefully. "The original structure was built around very specific constraints." Dalton sighed heavily. "That's what I thought." Mark keeps insisting he understands the project, but when I ask detailed questions, his answers are vague. It's like he's reading from a script he didn't write. Because that's exactly what he was doing. He had my documents, but not my understanding. The next morning, I received an email that made my heart race. "Lauren, this is probably unusual, but would you be willing to share your original proposal framework? I want to compare it directly with what Mark is presenting. If you're not comfortable, I understand. But I'm concerned we're heading in the wrong direction." I stared at my laptop screen for a full minute. This was the moment. Send the documents and potentially blow up Mark's deal. Or stay silent and let him fail on his own. Except this wasn't just about Mark. This was about a $45 million infrastructure project that would affect thousands of people. The work mattered more than my revenge. I organized the original files, removing any proprietary Bridgeton information, and sent them with a professional note. "Mr. Dalton, I'm attaching my original research and framework. This represents my independent analysis before company restructuring. I hope it provides useful context." Within an hour, he responded. "This is significantly different from what Mark presented. And frankly, much more thorough. Can we schedule a call?" The call lasted 3 hours. Dalton walked through every aspect of both proposals, asking detailed questions. I answered honestly, explaining the reasoning behind each decision. He occasionally stopped me to take notes. "Lauren, I need to be direct with you. This project is too important to proceed with someone who doesn't fully understand it. Mark has impressive credentials, but you built this from nothing. You know every corner of it." I stayed quiet, letting him continue. "I want to move forward with your firm instead of Bridgeton. Is that something you're equipped to handle?" My new company was literally 3 weeks old. I had no staff, no established reputation, no track record. Any rational person would have said no. But I'd spent 6 months building this deal. I knew it better than anyone. "Yes," I said. "I can handle it." We spent another hour discussing logistics. When we finally hung up, I sat in stunned silence. Mark hadn't just lost the deal. He'd lost it to me, the person he'd publicly humiliated and dismissed. Breaking the news to Mark happened through official channels. Dalton's office sent a formal letter to Bridgeton Construction, thanking them for their proposal but announcing they'd selected Pierce Infrastructure Consulting instead. I wasn't copied on the email, but I heard about it through mutual contacts. Apparently, Mark's reaction was legendary. Shouting, demanding explanations, threatening legal action. He called Dalton directly, which was a massive professional mistake. Dalton calmly explained that Lauren Pierce had demonstrated superior understanding of the project requirements. Mark argued that I'd stolen proprietary information. Dalton pointed out that all my work predated my termination and was documented accordingly. The conversation ended badly. Very badly. Meanwhile, I was dealing with a different problem. Actually delivering on a $45 million contract with zero infrastructure. I needed staff, systems, and credibility.
Fast.
I reached out to former colleagues, people I'd worked with before Bridgeton. Within a week, I'd assembled a small team of talented consultants who believed in the project. We worked 18-hour days, but the energy felt different. This was ours. The official signing happened 6 weeks after my termination. I dressed in my best suit and drove to the state office building, remembering the first time I'd made this drive for an exploratory meeting with Dalton. Back then, I'd been representing Bridgeton. Now I represented myself. The conference room was smaller than I'd imagined for such a significant moment. Dalton greeted me warmly, introducing me to other state officials. We signed papers, shook hands, and took official photos. It felt surreal. "You took a huge risk starting your own firm," Dalton said during a quiet moment. "That takes courage most people don't have." I thought about Mark's face when he'd fired me. The casual cruelty. The assumption I'd simply disappear. "Sometimes the risk of staying feels worse than the risk of leaving," I answered. He nodded thoughtfully. "I'm glad we took a chance on each other. This is how government contracting should work. Based on competence and trust, not just company size." Those words meant more than he probably realized. Mark's downfall happened gradually, then suddenly. First, there were rumors about mismanagement. Then formal questions from the Bridgeton board about why they'd lost such a significant contract. Mark blamed me, claiming I'd sabotaged the deal. But his emails and presentations told a different story. They showed someone who didn't actually understand the project he'd tried to claim. The board launched an internal review. They interviewed people who'd worked with Mark and discovered a pattern. Taking credit for others' work. Dismissing talented staff. Making strategic decisions based on ego rather than analysis. 3 months after I signed my contract, Mark was asked to resign. Not fired exactly, but close enough. His departure was announced with corporate language about pursuing new opportunities. Everyone in the industry knew what that meant. I heard through professional networks that he struggled to find equivalent work. His reputation had taken serious damage. Not because I'd actively destroyed it, but because his own actions had caught up with him. Sometimes karma doesn't need help.
It just needs time.
6 months into running my firm, I hired my 5th employee. We'd completed the first phase of the infrastructure project ahead of schedule and under budget. Dalton's office was so pleased they'd recommended us for 2 additional contracts. The growth felt manageable but exciting. My team was small but talented. We worked from a modest office in downtown Denver, nothing fancy, but it was ours. During a team meeting, my newest hire asked about the company's origin story. "I heard you used to work for Bridgeton Construction. Why did you leave?" The others looked at me with curiosity. They knew bits and pieces, but I'd never told the full story. "I was fired," I said simply, right before closing the biggest deal of my career. My boss wanted the credit for himself, so he removed me from the project. The room went quiet. "How did you end up getting the contract?" I smiled. The client valued relationships over corporate names. And I'd spent 6 months building trust. That couldn't be transferred through paperwork. Running my own company taught me things that working for others never could. The weight of responsibility felt different when every decision directly affected people who trusted me. When I made mistakes at Bridgeton, the company absorbed them. Now, my mistakes impacted my team's livelihoods. That pressure pushed me to be more thoughtful, more strategic. But it also freed me to work the way I believed was right. No more corporate politics. No more taking credit for others' contributions. When someone on my team did exceptional work, their name went on the report. I built the culture I'd wished for at my old job. Transparent. Collaborative. Meritocratic. The infrastructure project we'd won from Mark became a showcase for our approach. Other government agencies noticed. Within a year, Pierce Infrastructure Consulting had a reputation for reliability and innovation. We weren't the biggest firm, but we were becoming one of the most respected. That mattered more than size. Every success felt like another step away from the humiliation of that boardroom. I ran into Mark once, completely by accident, at an industry conference 18 months after my termination. He looked older somehow, tired. He was attending with a small consulting firm I'd never heard of, clearly in a diminished role. We made eye contact across the hotel lobby. For a moment, I thought he might approach me. Instead, he turned and walked the other direction. That encounter gave me no satisfaction. No triumph. Just a strange sadness. Mark had destroyed his own career through arrogance, and insecurity. I hadn't needed to do anything except be confident and patient. The revenge I'd imagined in those first angry weeks never materialized because it wasn't necessary. His actions had natural consequences that didn't require my involvement. Later that day, I gave a presentation about ethical project management. The room was packed. Afterward, several young professionals approached me with questions about starting their own firms. I shared my story honestly, including the parts about fear and uncertainty. 2 years after starting Pierce Infrastructure Consulting, we'd grown to 12 employees and handled 7 major projects. The infrastructure deal that started everything was nearly complete, ahead of schedule and receiving praise from state officials. Dalton had become not just a client, but a genuine professional mentor. During a project review meeting, he pulled me aside. "Lauren, I want you to know something. When I chose your firm over Bridgeton, some people questioned my judgment. They worried about going with such a new company." I nodded, remembering those uncertain early days. "But you've proven that talent and dedication matter more than corporate size. This project will be a model for future initiatives. And that's directly because of your leadership." His words carried weight because they were earned, not given. This success wasn't about defeating Mark. It was about building something meaningful, something that would improve communities and create opportunities. The personal vindication was just a side effect of doing good work. Today, I walked into my office and saw my team collaborating on a new proposal. They worked with an easy confidence that comes from mutual respect and shared purpose. None of them knew about Mark's betrayal. They only knew we built things that mattered. I thought about that conference room where I'd been fired. The humiliation, the rage, the cold determination that followed. That moment felt like an ending, but it had actually been a beginning. Mark taught me an important lesson, though not the one he intended. He showed me that staying in a situation where my value wasn't recognized was more dangerous than taking a risk on myself. His cruelty became the push I needed to discover my own strength. I don't wish him well, but I don't wish him harm either. I simply don't think about him anymore. His chapter in my story is closed. Mine is still being written, and every page belongs to me. That's the truest victory possible.